Good afternoon. Welcome to the Google UOB SME Leadership Academy webinar series. My name is Gerald, and I lead the mid-market Google Ads business for Singapore. I hope you, your co-workers, and your loved ones are all safe as we navigate through the uncertainties of COVID-19. I'm sure, like us here at Google, many of you are balancing work and personal commitments at home, which isn't easy. So thank you for taking the time to invest in yourself and your business by attending our webinar series. We hope these sessions will provide you with the content and insights you need during this crucial time. The SME Leadership Academy has expanded its capacity to help 4,000 SMEs by the end of 2021, a tenfold increase from the initially projected 400 SMEs. Together with UOB, we recently announced a new curriculum for the SME Leadership Academy, which has been customized to help business leaders of SMEs from the retail, tourism, and F&B sectors respond to the unprecedented challenges from the COVID-19 pandemic. This revised curriculum will teach you how to use digital solutions, including online collaboration tools, to be more effective when managing your businesses from home. You will also gain insights into effective people and business management during crises, which can then be turned into practical steps you can take to tackle the immediate challenges. If you have any feedback for us, please fill up the short survey we have at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerald, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second session of the SME Leadership Academy webinar F&B series. My name is Felix, and I lead the portfolio management function of UOB Business Banking. As we move into the third week of phase 2 reopening, I'm sure many of you, more than ever, will need to balance work commitments with personal responsibilities. So thank you for taking the time to join us this morning. Before we jump into the content, we recognize that some of you may be new to live stream, so we'd like to share a couple of tips to make this as good an experience as possible. Firstly, we highly recommend that you join the live stream via desktop for the optimum viewing experience. Secondly, we appreciate that you may have questions, so we have allotted 15 minutes Q&A at the end of the session. Please feel free to ask your questions throughout. You can do so via the comments section below, and please leave some time for your comments to appear after posting. Finally, we love to hear from you. Toward the end of the session, you will see a feedback survey appear. Please share your thoughts. They will be valuable inputs for our ongoing and future efforts. On that note, let's get started. The COVID-19 pandemic has lasted half a year now and triggered widespread slowdown to key economies in the world. What is the macro outlook for key economies like US and China? How bad will the recession be for Singapore? In addition, the US Federal Reserve and global central banks have all cut interest rates aggressively and embarked on unlimited quantitative easing. What do all these mean for us? What is the impact of the US dollar? And what can we expect for the renminbi and Singapore dollar? Our Global Economics and Markets research team would like to share our views on these key questions. We will first have Alvin Liu, Senior Vice President and Senior Economist, to cover the macroeconomic trends and developments. We will then have Kun Hao, Executive Director, Head of Markets Research, to comment on the implication of rate cuts and Singapore's GDP contraction. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Alvin. Over to you, Alvin.
Good morning, everyone. And I hope everyone is holding up well in the current situation. And today, our presentation is in two parts. First, I will cover on the macro section, and my colleague, Mr. Heng Kun Hao, will subsequently follow up with the financial markets outlook. And to begin with, I have this quote here that was chosen by my colleague, Kun Hao, and he will give a bit more explanation on why we put this quote here. But for now, I'll move on to the next slide and talking a bit on the macro situation. And I think principally a lot of people's minds is this the worst over for the COVID-19? I think to sum it up, we are looking at a U-shaped recovery, and this is perhaps this road is still somewhere before we get to a full recovery stage. And currently itself, we do see resurgence worries of the pandemic ahead. And here in this slide, we show the three shapes of recovery that we have placed on for COVID-19. V-shape, U-shape, as well as the bumpy L-shape. And these are some of the factors that we see in each case. But suffice to say, our current position is still that we will be expecting a U-shaped recovery in the current scenario. Although, if you look at what probabilities that we have put on V-shape and the L-shape, which is the worst case, they are not negligible, non-material numbers. Probability of a V-shaped recovery due to some of the better numbers that was showing up in recent weeks. We had the probability at about 30%, but at an L-shaped recovery of a probability of 25%, pretty much marks one of the risks that we see in the horizon, which is, of course, a second wave of infections coming in from the COVID-19. Now, on this slide itself, this is more like a pictorial presentation of the three cases that we see. The line in blue pretty much is like the V-shaped recovery, where we put it at probability of 30. The one in blue followed by the red line, which is our U-shaped probability. And of course, the yellow line would be the L-shaped recovery trajectory itself. Now, I think we have to be mindful of how when we look at this trajectory, right? When we look at the first point where we highlighted it as 4Q 2019, this is when the market was probably at its peak, strongest point, the global economy at its strongest point. And right now, where we are right now, 2Q is the lower point below, where all the three trajectories are diverging out from. And of course, at the final point where we have our base case scenario, which is the red line, that final point itself, we put there at a timeline at 4Q 2021. So this pretty much gives you the time frame of where we are looking at the recovery. If you're thinking we probably may have seen the lowest or the worst contraction in 2Q, but where we see the GDP will recover back to the same level as, say, fourth quarter of 2019, that will be some time away, which is around 2021, the last quarter itself. So that puts the perspective of how long where is this U-shape that we are talking about. And on the right side of the screen itself, you see some of the numbers given by international organizations, IMF, World Bank, and OECD. I think these are recently revised numbers, and the prognosis is, I think, in a short is not very promising. The IMF, for one, right, has the slightly most optimistic global outlook, which is a contraction of about 5% in 2020. World Bank is looking at slightly more than 5%, and OECD has two scenarios whereby the more optimistic scenario is looking at a -6% contraction in 2020 itself. And when you look at the recovery, while it is positive numbers in 2021, it does mean that at some point during 2021 itself, right, the recovery of the full extent of the downturn, right, can't be really covered by the uptick seen expected in the coming year itself. And in terms of the last point where WTO looks at the merchandise trade itself, global trade is expected to contract significantly in 2020. The numbers are given between minus 13% to as high as minus 32%. But although WTO kept its forecast, it did say that the amount of monetary and fiscal stimulus pumped in by the various governments, right, has elevated the situation, and the pessimistic outcome is now less likely. And now we move on to this slide where we look at all the key numbers in 2020 itself after 2019, right? You can see that in 2020 versus 2019, most of the economies are expecting to see significant contractions. But if you look at within the numbers itself, some economies are still expecting to grow positively. And the big picture is that the developed economies, if some of the key ones shown here, like UK, Euro area, Japan, US, they're expected to contract. And some of the contractions seen here, right, are at unprecedented levels, right, not seen since World War II. And if you look at the Asian economies, some of them are expected to contract as well, especially those that are more open to trade and more open to, for example, to tourism, such as Thailand. But there are economies that are still going to register positive growth. China, for one, is still expected to see positive growth, but the growth itself at 1.8%, right, is a far cry from the growth that was seen previously in the preceding years of 2017 to 2019. And mind you, during the 2018 and 2019 cases, we did see that there was, on the backdrop, US-China trade tensions that could have some downside impact on the economies, but still China managed to grow at these levels. But of course, when you look at the expectations for 2020 itself, growth levels is much lower. And for some of the Asian economies, most of them, ASEAN 6, for example, most of them are contracting, but Indonesia itself is still expected to see some positive growth, although we would have to admit that the growth outlook for Indonesia remains on the downside risk, especially if you see the current situation on COVID-19, whereby the cases in Indonesia have still been has still quite a bit of cases on COVID-19 itself. Here in this slide 7, we have some of the numbers that was released from IMF, a picture that is quite similar to our outlook in the previous slide, but also notice that the advanced economies that is highlighted in the earlier, in the front boxes itself, right, the contraction is at unprecedented levels, especially in Europe. In countries like France, Italy, and Spain, which are the most badly impacted countries by COVID-19, they are looking at excess of 10% contraction in the year 2020 itself. And if you look at the emerging markets and developing economies in the slide in the table below, right, some of them are also expected to see significant contractions. But as I pointed out again, some of the countries in here, right, are expected to see positive growth still in this year, such as China. And I think some of the regions itself, like ASEAN 5, the contraction is much less at 2%. Now it comes to the billion-dollar or trillion-dollar question itself. How bad is 2Q GDP going to be? In Singapore, our 2Q numbers are going to come out next week on the 14th of July. And China will also be releasing its 2Q numbers next week itself. And if you look at the numbers here, these are unprecedented contractions. For the US itself, we are expecting 35.2% contraction. UK in excess of 13%, Euro area in excess of 12% contraction. Japan closer to 8% contraction. But these are unprecedented numbers. But the problem with this, if you look at the forecast that we have here versus some of the market forecasts, right, the variance is quite wide. And this is due to the fact that the unknown depth of how much the 2Q contraction will be. And that is the big question mark. And that is also the reason why you see this big variance in the forecast of the growth numbers or the contraction numbers in 2020 itself. So this itself is some of the key numbers from the US to show an example that this is not your normal recession. If you look at the chart above, these are the few series of, I would say, the business cycles in prior years, and you can see that these are jobless claims. There is pickups of jobless claims, and there is recovery pictures, and there is sometimes sustained pickup. For example, that the green line itself in one of the years. But when we include the current period, then there is the chart below, and this is a normal spike in initial jobless claims in US. I think in total more than, I think it's a number closer to 25, 26 million jobless numbers, right, in claims, right, within the span of less than 2 months. So those are unprecedented. And when we look at in manufacturing activities grind to a halt during the months of March and April, and pretty much when we see the blue bars, right, those are the record lows, right, that were registered during those months. Of course, if we look at the latest numbers right now, those have seen quite significant improvements. But of course, this is just when we are now looking at the economy's reopening. There are also other risks. Of course, in services, the scale, you have to be mindful of the scale itself. And services is also, I think, the industry most of you are in F&B. The significant corrections, right, in the services was greater than in manufacturing. And the numbers have since improved. And this is largely due to the fact that a lot of the economies have reopened or in the process of reopening. But again, on the backdrop right now, if you've seen the news, right, there is a resurgence in the COVID-19 cases in many of the key economies that have reopened, and some of the places have started to switch back to some of the measures again and partially locking down. So there is that concern that this may not be the end of the story yet. Going forward, if you look at this is on tourism itself, right, and will probably be quite relevant to industries like food and beverage, because you see these numbers are the international arrivals for the US, for example. These are the numbers last year. I think they have record numbers of tourism going in terms of a few million. In terms of UK visitors last year alone, right, was about more than just under 450,000. But based on the latest number, which is about half a year already, right, the numbers have dwindled to close to 100% drop. So I think if you translate that to the impact on the industries that depend on tourism, right, you get the idea of how significant this correction could be. And Chinese tourists is a big source of tourist arrivals for many countries, including Singapore. And the chart below shows how big a drop it has been since the pickup of Chinese tourism in the late 2000 to current situation. And that is quite a significant impact on the industry itself. And we cannot leave the whole topic talking about the outlook, right, on the COVID-19 pandemic itself. We are really, as what WHO has put, we are far from over, as now daily cases have hit a record, not in Singapore, thankfully, but in many of the key countries that are quite impacted by it. US, for one, is more than 3 million right now, based on the latest numbers. Brazil is also fast catching up, more than 1.7 million, I believe the latest number. And this chart shows Russia as the third, but India currently has now overtaken that. And those are the key trends that in terms of the COVID-19. And finally, on the final part of what I will be speaking about is about the winners and losers. In terms of the losers from the COVID-19, right, I think it's quite clear as this chart shows, right. This is from a BCG study. The restaurants, travel has been quite badly hit, and public transportation and some of the entertainments as well, those are also similarly impacted. In Italy, the first the biggest component was gambling. And in US, if you follow the chart itself, it's luxury and fashion. But more or less, you can see that in different magnitudes, right? These are the key sectors that have been affected by some of the major economies. But who are the winners in this case? In this case, I think it's quite relevant that we talk about health-related sectors will be the one that is gaining from this. And household care, as highlighted here, organic foods, fresh foods, vitamins, and preventive health care, which is quite naturally given the nature of the current situation that we are in itself. But one of the things that probably will surprise you a bit is on savings itself, whereby savings are expecting to be one of the categories that gain. And you can see that especially in US. I think this one thing we have to be mindful of for the US itself is that the US had a huge amount of stimulus coming in the months of March and April. I think to the tune of close to $3 trillion in total. And a lot of that are going towards giving a big chunk of it, is giving checks to the US, to Americans, so to cushion them from the loss of the job losses and the pay losses itself. And that went directly into the bank accounts. And if you look at the data itself, during that 2 months, US, the cash deposits, right, really went through the roof, picked up by 2 trillion in April alone, right? 800 billion US dollars went into the US. But suffice to say, right, when if you think about the paychecks that is going into the US, then if the current situation improves, where people get back to the jobs, then this will be it will be elevated. But if there is a resurgence in cases in the US and the lockdowns come back, or some forms of restrictions come back, then these paychecks will not be able to last the the Americans, the households, and then the US government the Congress itself will have to look to pump in more money to them. And I think we'll end off in a more holistic discussion on this, is that the pandemic itself, right, is one of the kinds of recessions or triggers of recessions that we have not seen before in the past, where it is a demand and supply issue, right? This pandemic itself is 3 kinds of shocks rolled into one. It is a supply shock where it hurts demand. It hurts the supply chain, which is reflected in the fall in the manufacturing activities. It hurts demand, and it is also reflected. It will be reflected in how much the services industries contracted, because demand literally all just dried up with all the restrictions put in place, quarantines and the lockdowns. And third is, of course, it is also a financial shock, and that how the system is coping with it. And I think my colleague, Mr. Heng Kun Hao, will talk more on the financial impact from the COVID-19 pandemic. Kun Hao, this is over to you.
Okay, thank you, Alvin, and good morning, everybody. So you heard from Alvin about the very difficult macroeconomic backdrop. If you remember what he said, the IMF, and all the major so-called macro agencies are forecasting pretty much a big, 5% global contraction in GDP for this year. This synchronized recession has not happened before. It is probably going to be the deepest since World War II. And of course, this is probably the first time also, nearly every other country in the world will have a drop in per capita income. So the macro backdrop is very bad, but there's a disconnect here. Every time we speak to people, the typical question that comes out is, why is the stock market doing so well? Why are asset markets holding up? And yet the environment is clearly bad. And yet basically, everybody's worried about companies going bankrupt and people losing their job. So I'll try to address this in the next second half of this presentation. In short, it's a 3-letter word. It is the US Federal Reserve, or the Fed. They have done a lot in the past 1 quarter to basically, help stabilize financial markets. And this is important for all of us, especially in businesses, in this difficult period, because it all concerns your loans, it all concerns, your costs and your borrowing. So I'll just go through a few things. Now, if you look at this, now what the Fed has done is basically it's done what I call ultra or mega QE. If you look at this chart, this is a chart of the Fed's balance sheet. This circle here, or this oval here, basically tells us that the Fed's balance sheet has jumped from 4 trillion in March to about 7 trillion now. So in Q2, it's added 3 trillion US dollars. So that's not 3 billion, that's not 30 billion, that's not 300 billion, that's 3 trillion US dollars of basically liquidity that the Fed is pumping in just 3 months. And that's how incredible things are. If you look in comparison, 0809, if you remember Lehman crisis, that's just barely 1 trillion. That's QE1. QE2, around 2010, 2011, if you remember during the Greek debt crisis, that's about $500 billion across 1 year. That's, you can't see it if I don't point it out to you. QE3, 2012, 2013, a bit more than 1 trillion, but across 2 years. So this is 3 trillions in just 3 months. That's how incredible the amount of liquidity that Fed has pumped into financial systems. Now, if you go beyond that, everybody talks about helicopter money, and there it is. On top of all the stimulus by all the governments, the Fed has basically had 9 different intervention programs, and all in, the Fed has bumped up what you call money supply in the US by as much as 1/3. Okay, this is pure printing of money, and that's how significant things are. Money supply in the US is up by 1/3 now compared to a year ago. Lehman crisis was about 15% growth. Greek debt crisis was about 12% growth. Now you're up by about 1/3. That's very, very significant. Now, objectively, if you ignore everything else, ignore Donald Trump and everything else, any country that has a money supply that goes up by 1/3, the currency should be weak, interest rates should be low, which is what we're seeing now. US dollar is getting weaker, and interest rates are, of course, flatline near zero. I'll go into it a bit more detail later. A few more examples of what the Fed has been doing. Now, you can notice that the Fed has also basically flatlined all expectations of interest rates for the next 1 or 2 years. This is a chart of interest rates futures for the US for next year, 2021. You see all the lines are bunched around zero, which means market expectation is now firmly glued to zero for US interest rates for at least the next 1 year. If you look at the commercial paper market, those of us in Singapore probably are not very familiar with it, but in US, if you're SME or corporate and you need liquidity, like to pay your bills, to pay your suppliers, and basically to pay your workers, what you do is you assess the US commercial paper market in the 3 month, and you can notice what the Fed did. It's pushed down the cost of 3-month liquidity for US SMEs and corporates down to pretty much near zero, right? 3 months liquidity cost is just 16 basis points. That's as cheap as it can get in the US. Then, of course, if you look at the high yield market, and this is a little bit of a concern, but much better, for companies in the US that aren't doing very well, meaning weak balance sheet or in the wrong type of industry, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's tourism, or your so-called your shipping cruise lines, so on and so forth, the cost for your 10-year debt has been brought down from a very, very punitive 10% to just around 6%. So still worse than before the crisis, but at least it's much more manageable, which is why you see so few bankruptcies in the US, at least for now. And of course, we all talk about financial markets. All of us, in one way or another, we need to borrow US dollar. And you can see that the cost of US dollar is also brought down to about par. The volatility of March is over. So all these charts I want to tell you, give you examples, basically, of all the things that the Fed has done, to basically control and ring-fence financial markets as the real economy, as the macro economy, as what Alvin said, tries to recover, tries to stabilize from COVID-19. So then it brings us to the question, what's the implication for interest rates? What's the implication for currencies? Well, quite a few. First, if you look at this chart, I think this is probably one of the more important chart if you have currency risk. And I think many of us will probably have some form of currency risk. You probably purchase, your goods from abroad in one way or another, and you probably have some form of a US dollar risk if you have borrowings. You'll notice that the US dollar interest rate support has collapsed because of the strong easing by the Fed. But the red line, which is the US dollar index, is still roughly up there and slowly coming down. So this is an important thing because logically, the red line should follow the blue line. For any currency, if the interest rate support is lower, that currency has to come down. It's as simple as that. So which means that the US dollar should get weaker, in the months ahead if this massive easing from the US Federal Reserve continues. Then, if you move on outside the US to Asia, something very interesting has happened. Now, you saw Alvin's chart of all the very tough, financial, so-called macro condition in the US. Let's look at Asia. We are operating in Singapore. We need to be very, very clear what's happening in China, and of course, by default, the rest of Asia, because what's happening in China will affect the rest of us in Asia. And if I can be a bit blunt, if China recovers from COVID-19 fast and quickly, all of us will be heaving a big sigh of relief. So the initial signs are hopeful that China is coming out of COVID-19 in a much better way. This is a chart of passenger railway and internal air travel, traffic in China, meaning within China, the high-speed rail and domestic airlines. And you can see the amount of passenger for internal so-called travel has literally collapsed in first quarter to pretty much near zero. That was when, after Chinese New Year, China was locked down. But after March, when China reopened, you notice a very strong rebound in April. So that's a good sign. The latest weekly numbers suggest that we have rebounded back to about 2/3 of where things were. So that's a good start. Then if you move on to basically manufacturing, you can see the PMI index or the Purchasing Manager Index staged a big contraction again in March. And now we are back to positive, above 50, expansionary. So that's incredible. That tells you that China's factories, we don't feel it here, of course, not yet, but China's factories are starting to recover and are starting to rebound. So that's a very hopeful thing. Of course, if you look at this GDP chart, which is quarterly, that's a bit laggard. China is registering a minus 6.8% in first quarter, but we believe that the above mentioned rebound in domestic travel, spending, monthly PMI production numbers will suggest that China will register back to positive growth in second quarter and gradually resume its recovery, meaning it was minus 6.8 in the first quarter, will go to 3.9 positive in second, 4.5 positive in third, 5.7 positive in fourth. And if you add it all up, these four numbers will give you a positive number. Doesn't sound like a lot because we came from 6%, right, last year, but it is still a positive growth. And that is very, very important for all of us in Singapore and in Asia. And if you look at the rest of the indicators, for example, this is a chart of renminbi. And I'm sure if you follow the narrative in the currency space in the past few days, you notice that renminbi is much stronger. And that's very surprising to a lot of people. Why is renminbi stronger when Donald Trump keeps finding trouble for China, right? Why is renminbi stronger when you have all these issues, political issues between US and China, Hong Kong, and US is looking to sanction China, so on and so forth. Okay. And I think this is a sign first that markets are forward-looking. Markets look at that macro divergence between US and China, and market feels that China is recovering much faster than the US. And of course, we see the flip side of a coin. Alvin mentioned earlier about the COVID-19 cases, right? And it's not a joke when the US cases of COVID-19 has now jumped above 3 million. It's not a joke when in one single day, US now has 60,000, 59,000 new cases. And we in Singapore, we are complaining that our cases are 40 over 1,000 heading towards 50. So US is just one day, you get 59, 60,000. So Donald Trump, for the lack of a better word, has a lot of blood on his hands. And I'm just not sure how things are going to work out for the US in terms of COVID-19. So if The market recognizes this. You can see that renminbi is much more stable now. And today, we are looking at about 701. So that's a very good improvement. And there's not much volatility or spread. So that explains why the US dollar is a bit weaker and Asian currencies like the Singapore dollar is a bit stronger. So moving on finally to Singapore, let me just add on a few things. We are following our GDP numbers very closely. Now, the second quarter GDP numbers will be released next Tuesday on the 14th of July. That's the scheduled release. Our forecast at UOB is that we will see a dip, which is that red line, right, in the second quarter of as much as minus 10%, all the way down. So if you, to be all honest, if you speak to any of the banks out there, most of us are forecasting around 10% dip in GDP for the second quarter. And I think this is very clear to all of you, especially many of you are in the retail and hospitality and the food and beverage sector. Basically, second quarter, we have a circuit breaker, right, across April and May. So that pretty much flatlines all activity in terms of spending, in terms of domestic consumption all across Singapore. So second quarter will be difficult. We all know that. Let's see how the numbers turn out. But the catch is this. Once you move on, how do we rejuvenate? How do we, how should I say, trigger the rebound in the economy in the second half of the year? How do you, restart the very, very devastated pillars of the economies, meaning retail, tourism, and of course, construction, and manufacturing, so on and so forth. And of course, recently we have moved into phase 2. I think many of you are excited. At least you can reopen your restaurants and establishments. But of course, there are also some, concerns giving feedback, for example, that even when hotels are reopened, 90% of the hotel revenues come from tourists. So it doesn't matter if you allow staycation because that doesn't move the needle. If tourists don't come, if the world doesn't recover, if we don't open our borders, it is still difficult for the hospitality sector as a whole. So this is a key concern. How do we jumpstart the economy in the second half of the year? But, next Tuesday's Q2 GDP number in Singapore, do look out for it. We see minus 10%, and we want to see how bad the individual components are and what comments there are from MTI and MAS in terms of how the economy is headed in the second half of the year. Now, overall, the government's official forecast is this, basically -4 to -7%. And I think all of us know that, pretty much we are gearing towards -7% and the rate things are going. We won't go straight into phase 3, that's for sure. We won't go straight into a full opening, that's for sure. This will be a very long drawn phase 2 opening, given the resurgence in domestic so-called cases in Singapore, not just Singapore, but in Japan, in Hong Kong, in Australia, Victoria State is also back in lockdown as well. So we're all mindful that this will be a long drawn phase 2 and not a straight full recovery into the things before COVID. So that's the GDP outlook. Now, if we move on to the economy in Singapore, what is most important? And I think I can't say about politics, but I'm sure, we all know the big discussion over the past 2 weeks during the campaign, which is jobs, jobs, jobs. And rightfully so that, our government and everybody is concerned about keeping jobs and maintaining jobs for Singapore. Now, this is very important because our country is small, because our country is so open, right? At the end of the day, for all our 5 million Singapore citizens, Singaporeans, this is just about jobs, right? So you can see, if somebody asks us what is the most important determinant for the Singapore economy, I would say job. All the measures like JSS, all this is to lower the cost of your firms and companies over this few months of difficult downtime, to ensure that companies and SMEs stay afloat, to ensure that basically people don't retrench, and of course, companies don't go bankrupt. And the background, the MES also allows various schemes, of debt forgiveness, of lower borrowing costs channeled through banks, to all SMEs to help tie over this difficult period. Now, this is a chart of jobless rates in Singapore. You can see, for example, during the Asian financial crisis, the jobless rate went up to about 3%, right? Global financial crisis, the jobless rate went up to about 3% as well. Now, this is interesting because these two are what you call financial crisis. And our Singapore jobless rate went up about 3 to 3.5. Now, the comparable one is SARS. SARS was in 0304. You can see during SARS, Singapore's jobless rate was near to 5%. That's the concern of everybody. We are now at COVID. So we have a slow, steady climb. You notice there's a slow, steady climb of 2% to 2.4 over the past 2 years or 3 years. That's obviously because of Donald Trump. That's because of the US-China trade war. That's because, all these changes that he has triggered in terms of the supply chains and all the tariffs have helped move basically, job opportunities, made some manufacturing jobs obsolete and structural, redundancy, and that's pushed up a little bit of the jobless rates in Singapore. So our forecast is that, you may well see a jobless rate that goes up to 3 and 3.5. I think all of us are mentally prepared for the second half of the year to have this. The key crux of the matter is how do we jumpstart the economy, as you said earlier, and how to prevent these jobless rates from moving up too fast. Because once you lose your job, and I think we all know the harsh reality, it goes down the slippery slope from here on. You lose your jobs, you have no earnings, you have no savings, you can't spend, and then the family gets affected, and it just goes from bad to worse. So that's the key priority. That's the key metric in Singapore that we all look at. In terms of interest rates, I think this is very important for all of you. If business is bad, if you have no revenue, at the very least, you want to make sure your borrowing cost is low. And remember what I said earlier about the Fed pumping $3 trillion US. Remember what I said about the Fed earlier, doing helicopter money, printing money that pushes up money supply by 1/3 in the US. This is happening in Singapore as well, not in such a big deal, but our Singapore money supply is also up by about 10%. Quite a lot for a country like Singapore, although it's not apparently obvious. And that has pushed interest rates in Singapore all the way back down towards zero. So for example, SOR is now about 20 basis points. That's your light blue line. And SIBOR is around 50 basis points, just below 50. That's a dark blue line, both in the 3 months. And of course, the US, LIBOR is just in between around 30 as well. So all your key interest rate benchmarks are pushed down near towards zero, and you'll probably have a repeat of what we have around 2010 to 2014 period. Remember that time, that period, that's what everybody calls the China hard landing period, the 中国硬着陆, which everybody's worried about China going into a hard landing, a recession, so on and so forth. So interest rates will flatline around zero, but I think it's important to appreciate that interest rates will not go into negative. So that's very important because recently there's a lot of news articles that suggest that, if COVID continues like that in the US, if we don't get a vaccine anytime soon, right? If Donald Trump continues to do all these crazy things, will the Fed need to cut into negative? The answer is no, because there's still a lot of things the Fed can do. And of course, in Singapore, it's going to be difficult for interest rates, or should I say anywhere else except Japan and Europe, which is having deflation. It's difficult for interest rates to go into negative, because there is still credit costs. So this will basically ensure that rates will stay a bit above zero, but at least we are not seeing this. We are seeing near zero. So that's the expectation for interest rates. Finally, for currencies, my last chart for today, which is basically currencies, is on the Singapore dollar. Remember what I said earlier? US dollar is losing interest rate support. So that is very, very clear. There were some concerns that the US dollar may collapse. Yes and no. Our view is that the US dollar will get weaker, but the pace will be manageable. It will not collapse. You notice dollar Sing, we were at around 145. We came down towards 140. And last month, we went below 140 to about 139 now. So as you know, the MAS, manages monetary policy with a trade-weighted basket for Singapore dollar. That's the value of the Singapore dollar on a trade weight versus our key trading partners like China, Malaysia, Europe, so on and so forth. So this is the blue bar. When times are okay, right, this MAS policy is to keep the Singapore dollar a bit more expensive, meaning we will keep it growing at a much more positive pace, meaning the blue line will be above the neutral bar. This is the Singapore dollars, basically, main so-called policy where the MAS wants to keep the Singapore dollar a little bit strong, to prevent speculative attacks and also to keep inflation down. Now, when times are bad, the policy swings to a neutral, which is what's happened now, right? Since April or late last year, our Singapore dollar trade-weighted basket is now back down to neutral, right? And that basically makes the Singapore dollar a little bit more competitive vis-a-vis the whole region. Now, you will ask, if the Singapore trade-weighted basket is back to neutral, why is dollar Sing still down at 139? Why does the Singapore look so strong against the US dollar? That's, of course, because the US dollar is weak. So every other currency is gaining against the US dollar, right? Renminbi is now relatively strong. Australian dollar is back up. It's recovered like 15%. Those of you with investment in Australia will be probably, saying that I should have bought the Aussie 3 months ago, right? Things are, of course, going difficult in the UK with Brexit, but yet the pound is still relatively stable. So every other currency is gaining against the US dollar, and the Sing is keeping that same neutral pace. So this is where we are, right? And I just want to repeat, look out for next Tuesday's GDP number for Singapore for the second quarter. That will determine what we can look out for in terms of the currency and the economy in the months ahead. And of course, for interest rates, at least have the comfort to know that we are near flatline, near zero, at the very least for the next 1 or 2 years. So on that note, I'll end my presentation and I'll pass the time now back for our Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Khun Hao and Alvin, for your insights. So for those of you, if you wish to access the latest forecast, the GDP forecast, which Khun Hao has mentioned, I posted the link in the comments section below, right? www.uobgroup.com/research. We now move into Q&A, but before we start with the questions, just a quick reminder to please fill out the feedback survey, which you should see appear on the top right of your screen. Please do share your thoughts with us. Your inputs will be valuable as we move through this program. Okay, so we will now go into the first question. That would be for Alvin. So Alvin, for the rest of 2020, what are the key events that SMEs should look out for? And as well, how do you see the outlook for hospitality in the last quarter of this year?
Okay, thanks, Felix. Okay, for the key events, right, of course, COVID-19 remains one of the things that you have to watch, how the number of cases is panning out, whether there's going to be resurgence in some numbers. But of course, related to that is which is something that we did not highlight in the text, in the presentation, but we have mentioned, is about the development of a vaccine. That's really the crux of how we can get out of this COVID-19 situation. We are not medically trained. We see news that there are quite a few already in the late stages of trials. It seems that there is quite a bit of optimism that things we could get one within. I think President Trump is a bit too optimistic, saying that it will be by the end of this year. But there are more cautious approach in some areas that they're looking at within 6-12 months. The other elephant in the room outside of COVID-19 that you should be looking out for, in one short word, is geopolitics. In a slightly longer number of words, right, it will be US-China relations. And we know that is something that is going to be, and that has already taken the headlines together with COVID-19. And with that itself, the other event that you look out for, at the end of the year probably would be the US presidential elections. Now, some people might say that if we have a different president, not Donald Trump, right, things might be different between US and China. But the hard fact is that we would ask people to look at how the Congress has behaved, the US lawmakers have behaved towards towards China in this period during this period. If you recognize that during this, the two parties, the Democrats and Republicans, they do not agree on a lot of things. But when it comes to issues on China, right, the agreement is almost unanimous between them. And that pretty much will signify to you, right, regardless of the president that will be elected at the end in November, right, this US-China issue, right, will not go away. The only difference is perhaps that instead of having a very cowboy style of negotiation like Trump, if you get another president, the negotiation will be more nuanced and more cordial, but nonetheless, right, it will be still targeted at China. So we will think that this will still persist on. In terms of the hospitality outlook, I would say that it will be very challenging still in 2020. The key thing is that despite the fact that on 1st of July, where we open up some of the key tourist attractions in Singapore, right, the crux of the recovery for hospitality in Singapore, right, is the return of tourists. And we are not seeing that yet. And that, with the number of cases picking up in some of the key places, key countries whereby we used to welcome their tourists to Singapore, right, that will put it even in a more difficult space where how the tourist numbers can return back to a fraction of what it used to be. We're not even talking about 100%. We're talking about a fraction of it. And right now it's still very difficult. And therefore, right, if you look at the hospitality sector, in 2020, right, it will be very difficult. In 2021, right, depending on how these restrictions and these green lanes and how to bring the tourists back, right, that is really still a question mark. And I will still put it that it will probably still be a challenging area for tourism and hospitality, right, in 2021.
Okay, thanks, Alvin. And this next question is this: why is there a contradiction between V and U-shaped recovery seen in the financial and global economies?
Okay, let me answer this before. I would like to share something which is from one of my our asset management, which will probably be a easier way to view and to see the. Do you all see this chart right now here? Okay, basically, right, if you look at this chart here on the screen, A to B to Z, right, that is the U-shape recovery itself. The blue line here will represent what you call the equity markets. And you know that equity markets itself is forward-looking. So when the pandemic hits, right, even before the data comes out, right, the stock market corrects huge way, in a big way, to the point B. But then markets are also forward-looking. They have a plan. They have seen a plan where, let's say, we think that by Q4 to 2021, right, the economy will recover in the U-shaped form, and markets will price themselves accordingly to look towards that point itself. So at that point, right, where they meet, right, this is where the difference is when you look at where the blue square root shape is where the financial markets are performing, but the U shape is where the economic recovery is. How you reconcile the two ideas itself. But of course, the word of caution right now is if the markets are forward looking and they think that the recovery is due, let's say, end of this year, but somehow something along the way now goes very wrong. That means that there's a huge resurgence. That means the recovery could be pushed out further from this timeline. And if that happens, right, then you might see the equity markets correcting themselves to adjust for the further out timeline of the recovery.
Okay, thanks, Alvin. Okay, before we move to the next questions, again, just a quick reminder to fill out the short feedback survey on the top right of your screen. Okay, next questions I think would be more for Kun Hao. So it's relating to the currency. There are actually two questions. Okay, the first is what is the outlook for SGD? But I think you sort of have covered this in your final slide earlier. And this next question is, given that the US dollar may collapse, how do you see this risk?
Okay, thank you, Felix. Before I talk about currency, just to add to what Alvin is saying about V and U, I think this is a very common question everybody's asking. Why is there a disconnect between stock markets and the real economy? Especially from many of you who are from the hospitality and the food and beverage sector. Nearly every week you hear news of very famous names that are going under. Like for example, previously Starker has announced closure, and of course just today it's been announced that basically Papa Rich has some issues as well. That's in the papers. So we're very mindful of that, and I think that's like what Alvin. I want to inject a word of caution into this. We are economists. We look at financial markets and the economy, and you can say that we worry a lot. And the worry is that in the months ahead, if COVID-19 doesn't get controlled, if there's no proper vaccine, if there's no international travel, then you get more and more companies going under, so on and so forth, more what we call in banking, called credit issues, so on and so forth. So just be very mindful of that and don't get carried away with the V, right? The V is partly also because the Fed has pumped in 3 million. The V is also partly because US money supply has been bumped up by 30%. Now, if one day the Fed decides to slow down a bit of the tap, you will feel the difference. So just be a bit mindful of that. Back to of course, the question about the Singapore dollar and the US dollar. Singapore dollar is a bit ironic. Keep in mind, in the background, the US dollar is weakening. So if the US dollar is weakening, it may be difficult for the Singapore dollar to weaken, despite the fact we have a recession. I got people asking me, shouldn't dollar sink be at 145 than 139 now? Because we are in the deepest recession since independence. The answer is no, because in the backdrop, the US dollar is weakening. And what we're doing is, as long as we keep pace with the US dollar weakness on a trade-weighted basis, that's fine. So if the US dollar weakens, for all you know, we may even see 138 or 137 against the US dollar. It feels like the Singapore dollar is strong, but everywhere else, every other currency is strengthening in the US dollar. The catch is, if you look at the cross rates, for example, Aussie Sing, for example, Euro against Sing, Renminbi against Sing, or Ringgit against Sing, you'll realize that, for example, Renminbi against Sing is quite stable around 5 over the past 2-3 months. Ringgit against Sing, I'm sure many of us has the exposure, is quite stable around 3, over the past 2-3 months. So that tells you a lot that our currency more or less is stabilizing against the regional currencies. So that's on that part. Now, the part about US dollar collapse, there's been a lot of worries over that. And I think some of the so-called the academics out there are suggesting that because of all the bad things Donald Trump has done, all the wrong things he's done to the economy, because of how messed up the US economy is, because he's going to make the US Treasury bankrupt, US dollar should collapse. The answer is not so straightforward. Although we agree the direction of the US dollar is down, and you keep hearing this, but the answer is that no matter what, US dollar is still the predominant payment currency in the world. To put it bluntly, US dollar is still king. We can complain a lot, but if you compile all the FX transactions in the whole world, right, US dollar still accounts for huge 81%, right? And renminbi only accounts for 2%. That's it. After all the effort to internationalize the renminbi, it's just 2%. US dollar is still the predominant payment currency, and that will not go away. And of course, all the central banks in the world still holds US treasuries. Predominantly about 2/3 of central bank assets is in US dollar. So that unfortunately will not change anytime soon in the next few years. And that is why we don't see a US dollar collapse. Although that direction is there. Yep. Thank you, Felix.
All right. Thank you, Kunal. I think we've answered all the questions. Maybe we'll just give it another few seconds. All right. Thank you for everyone's time and your engagement today. If you have further questions or wish to find out more about UOB's solutions tailored for F&B businesses, please scan the QR codes that you see on screen. We hope you found today's webinar of value and will join us for the upcoming sessions. The next session will be held on Tuesday, July 14 at 11 a.m. with Google. You will learn about Google My Business, a tool for local businesses who want to connect with customers on Google Search and Maps. You will also receive step-by-step instructions on how to set up and the tools you can leverage to drive your F&B business online presence for free. In the meantime, keep learning. Do go through the resources on SME Leadership Academy and grow with Google Singapore websites. Thank you everyone again for attending. Stay safe and healthy. We hope to see you in the upcoming sessions.